everybody, welcome back to another Stoneforge gaming video. Today we're going to be taking a look at how to create a gaming board. This is a 2x2 sheet of MDF that we're going to start off with. I've just simply cut it out. I just use a circular saw for it because that does the job pretty easily with MDF. And what we're actually going to start by doing is actually taking some of this heavy grit sandpaper and actually roughing up the surface here. Now the reason that we're doing this is because of the fact that when we go to glue other things down to it, what's actually going to happen is if we don't have a texture on there, the glue will not stick into those grooves, and that's what's going to happen when we do, after we have done this sandpaper process, is it will actually make the glue kind of, it will flow into all these little nooks and crannies that we've created by the sandpaper, and it will glue down much stronger. Now we're actually going to begin to place down some bits and pieces of plaster rocks that I had left over from the Woodland Scenics rock molds that I've done quite a bit, just bits and pieces here and there, and we're just going to kind of spread them out around on the board here and there so that we are just not necessarily overdoing it with pieces. We don't want to make it so basically cluttered that we can't put down additional terrain pieces or things like that. So we're just kind of here just making sure that we are spacing it out before we just start gluing stuff down. Now we're going to be using hot glue because of the reason that if we were to use PVA with this and then we were to use PVA with the next portion, we would actually have a problem where the glue would actually, because anytime you add water to a white glue, PVA glue, Elmer's glue, whatever you want to call it, it actually reactivates and becomes sticky again. So that's why we're using hot glue, and we're just kind of putting little dots down there. So now what we're actually going to do is we're going to take some of this. This is actually just dirt, just backyard dirt that I have, and I just filtered it through a sieve that I have. And what we're going to do now is we're actually going to put some of this this dirt in a mix with the Elmer's glue, and what's going to happen is this is how we're going to create the texture for our board. It's going to be a very fine texture, which is great because when we go to paint it up, what's going to happen is it's going to pick up all those little tiny details that comes naturally when you use dirt or sand or very fine grit. And what we're just going to do is we're just going to mix it up. Like I say, I like to use just plastic forks and knives. You get them after a kid's birthday and stuff. I just hold on to them. I don't throw them away. I don't really use them for much else during the rest of the year, but I got a couple of birthdays every year, so I just use those, and then I'll use those. So what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of mix this up into sort of a paste, sort of the consistency of like a thick yogurt, something along those lines. And what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of slap this on here at first. We're just going to try to get as much as we can onto the board so that when we do scrape it on there, you can see the sort of consistency that we have here. And so what we're going to do is just kind of place this on. But when we place it on, we're actually going to spread it out. We're going to thin it out, make sure that we have basically created enough room so that the PVA can dry without actually having any sort of issues. Because sometimes if you put PVA glue on too thick, the under portions of the glue, like it will actually dry and harden on top because it's air activated. So underneath sometimes won't dry completely, and it might take weeks in order for the stuff to dry. So really you want to kind of spread it thin enough. You don't want it to where this whole piece is going to peel off, but at the same time you want to make sure that it's thin enough to where we are not necessarily worrying too much about it. So now we're actually going to be doing our base coat, and what we're going to do here is we are actually going to use some of this brown and yellow. Now I'm using this for Bushido, this particular board, so what I wanted to do was kind of have some yellow tones in there for my main tone. You guys know my sort of normal tone, that Borderland style. Now this will still work for a lot of the terrain that I've done with that Borderland style because the tones are similar, but this will kind of create a little more of a maybe a medium yellowish brown, so that when we basically put our tones down, basically when we put our different pieces of terrain down, we won't have, it won't be crazy different, but it will be enough different that will kind of give it what I think will be a cool tone for Bushido, because that's, like I say, the game that I'm mainly using it for. Now, you could use any particular colors that you wanted to. You could use it for any sort of game. If you were wanting to do a more straight up high fantasy, you could do more just regular browns, or if you wanted to do, say, Age of Sigmar, you could do, I don't know, if you want to do a Realm of Fire board or something like that, you could do with a lot of reds and oranges and stuff. So you could use all of these same techniques for any particular board that you're using. So what we're going to do is just kind of spread this around here and there, making sure that we're getting into all of the nooks and crannies. And again, with this process, we're just wanting to make sure that we're getting a good solid coat. We don't want it to be overly thick. That's why we're kind of spreading it around, and we're getting it in all the little nooks and crannies here. You can see I'm kind of stippling in some places. I'm kind of just spreading the paint about, because what we're not trying to do is we're not trying to get the paint so thick that we are causing problems for ourselves, because we want to keep that sort of natural texture that the fine dirt that we've filtered out is actually giving us. And if we get too thick a paint, what we'll actually have is sort of like bubbles and lumps and stuff like that. So you can see here we've actually base coated the entire board. Now we're just going to begin to actually do some of our highlights and do some of the painting that we have for it. So we're going to paint some of the rocks and some of the, so we're actually going to start with this sort of just regular old gray. It's just, I believe this is called pure gray. And what we're actually going to be doing is just base coating some of the different pieces. So what we're actually going to do is kind of creating a little bit of a wash with it. We don't want to go overly thick with this. We just kind of want to use it and make it into a wash so that we can let that flow into some of the crevices and into some of the details that we already have, because we have a lot of fine details on here. So, and what this is to do is to actually break up some of that just flat brown that we would normally have if we just left it as the normal brown that we have. Now, with this, what we're going to want to do is similar to what we were doing with the base coat, but not so thick. We just want to kind of spread this around and kind of make some jagged edges. You don't want to go like too round with it, because we find that very often in nature we don't really find very rounded rounded edges on things, or too straight of edges on things. So like on a rock or something like that, we wouldn't generally find a perfectly square edge. You can see my paint here isn't wanting to cooperate. So, but that's actually fine. That's enough. Sometimes that'll happen with these sort of large dropper bottles. They get kind of clogged. But again, with this green here, what we're going to be doing is just adding some paint, adding some water to it to create a different tone in some of the different areas. And again, we're going to be putting flock and things like that on it and dry brushing this up. So the tone that you're actually seeing right now is not going to really reflect necessarily what the tone is going to look like when we're all said and done, because of the fact that we're going to add layers and layers on top of this. So generally 2 or 3 more layers. We still have to paint up our rocks. We still have to, and we're going to just kind of do this in different spots about the board. You can see I'm going to add a little bit of orange on here as well. And then we are going to, the reason I use these 3 colors is these 3 colors, orange, gray, and green, you all find pretty regularly in nature. Now you could also use a red, but if you were going to use a red for this, I would say tint it maybe with a little bit of brown, because pure red is also kind of hard to find in nature, unless like in dirt and in rocks and things like that. There are those things geologically that we will find, but in general, these are some colors that you're going to find. If you go outside and pick up a rock from your yard, you might see tints of gray in there. You might see tints of brown, green, or orange. Now, Now that we have this, we are actually going to mix up our main dry brushing portion. Basically, this is our main highlighting color. This coat that we did, we are using the oranges because that's a tone that comes across very well when we're dry brushing. And the white will actually, because basically a lot of times I almost never use pure white in my highlights, but I like to tint things with white because it actually brings up the color variation that you have. It brings that tone up one step higher when you use a white. So you can see here we're actually going to end up with a sort of a light tan, like an orangish tan color, and that will be good because we have that sort of brown tone, we have our greens, we have our grays, everything mixed in. And when we go to dry brush up this next color, what's actually going to happen is that's going to pick up and it will contrast with the colors that we already have down. So we're just going to very basically, you can see I've already used this this a little bit, this paper towel. We're just going to kind of get as much of the paint out of our brush as we can, and then we're going to kind of overbrush a little bit. It's going to be an overbrush sort of dry brush, but we're just going to kind of go back and forth. We don't want to go too heavy with this because what'll happen is if you go too heavy, you might start get streaking, which is what a lot of people tend to get when they do their dry brushing, is they get sort of streaks because there's not enough of the paint that's actually out of the bristles of your brush. So we just want to get as much out of there as we can and then begin dry brushing back and forth. Generally, I like to go back and forth and from different angles because of the fact that when we do this from different directions, there are details that will get picked up from different directions. So if you say you have a sharp edge on one part of a rock, you can see here that it's beginning to pick up some of those the textures that we have created with the dirt and with the rocks. We're actually going to continue on painting up the rocks here, and we're just going to use the sort of granite, I believe it's granite or pewter color there, and what we're going to do is just and so what we're going to do here is the same exact steps that we were doing before with when we were dry brushing up the main portions of the board, but since we're just using this sort of grayish color, what we're going to be doing is kind of more of an overbrush actually, where you're going to leave more of the color on the bristles and a little more of the paint. And you can see here where I'm just going around, not trying to get every little edge of the rocks. I'm just simply kind of over coating, just kind of coating the larger portions. And if there is some sort of overspray or overbrushing onto the ground, that's fine because there are grays in our base tone. So when we do this, you can see here now that we have all these rocks all basically coated. Now what we're going to do is add a little bit more color to them. And again, I'm going to go with sort of an off-white so that when we dry brush up this next step, we will actually have more of, you can see I'm going actually with a lot of white compared to the brown because of the fact that we want it as a highlight, not as a base tone. So when this time, whereas before we kind of overbrushed and got a lot of paint, a lot of color and pigment onto our rocks, now you can see what we're actually going to be doing is dry brushing that sort of, you can see we have our mixed up color now. Now this is almost a cream sort of color, not actually like that tan that we had before. So when we dry brush our color on now, we will kind of do away with, we'll kind of begin to highlight up rather than so we're just going very, very light. You can see I'm kind of going all over the place very quickly because of the fact that you don't need to necessarily get in all the cracks and crevices because this is a highlight. This is not actually, it's not a wash, it's not anything like that. You don't have to worry about necessarily getting on the edges. You're just trying to hit the points where the light shining down, so we're assuming because this is like a battlefield or something, that it would shine down and it would be like the sun, basically, something along those lines. So for this next step, we're going to just be taking some of this PVA, this Elmer's glue, and what we're actually going to be doing is just kind of spreading this around. Now, when we do this, this is actually for the flocking process. Now, I like, when I flock when I put down my flock, I actually like to go thinner the first time rather than thick, because sometimes you, not that I don't put enough glue down, I actually put a lot of flock down, but I spread my PVA out. Now, one of the things that I'm doing very differently with this particular board is because we took a lot of time, right? We took a lot of time dry brushing and getting all those tones and all those mixed colors. So we wouldn't want to simply just flock up the board if we were and cover up all of that hard work that we spent all that time doing. So what we're going to do is we're going to we want to go light with this. So that's why I'm spreading the PVA into a thin consistency rather than basically, if I could get my arm out of the way, I should have shot this differently, but the idea, what we're actually going to be doing is kind of get some of the flock within your fingers and kind of spread it almost like you would like a seasoning on like a hamburger or a piece of meat. You're actually going to kind of run it through your fingers, and so you can see here, this is actually when it's all said and done, this is how it's going to look. Now you can see I just showed you how to do it, the green there. You're just going to run that through your fingers. But now what we're actually doing, because like I say, we don't want to cover up all that fine detail that we did, so now we're actually going to brush off some of this excess flock, some of the stuff that's not stuck on very well. You don't try to gouge, you just want to use your brush to kind of flick some of the excess off. Anything that will come up is fine, because we do this before we seal. So you can see there's bits of flock that are coming off, and you can see the colors that we painted in there and the highlights that are going to come up through all of that. Now we're going to add some of the fun details. So we have some Army Painter tufts, we have some different colored lichens, and then so we're basically just going to glue this down. You can see the lichen. I have actually two different colors of lichen, this sort of greenish yellow color, and then like a more straight up green color. And what we're going to do, very similar to how we were doing before, we're just going to kind of pick spots that's on the board that make it look good. We're just trying to accent. We don't want necessarily the entire board to be just tall grass, because that wouldn't necessarily work very well for gaming, because you're trying to put miniatures down. Now, if you're doing a display piece, if you're trying to do a diorama or something like that, then maybe that would work. If you're going for that sort of a deal, if you're trying to make a field or something like that. But you can see what we're going to do here is we're going to press, especially with this lichen, because of the fact that it is very flexible, we're going to kind of press it down in there, because it will kind of spring back some, but we want to allow the glue to seep into as many of the fibers as we can. So you can see it just kind of gives it a different texture on the board than the flock that we have done. And what we're going to do is just kind of tear off little tiny pieces and put them on some of the different spots that we have. So this piece over here, next to this rock. Now I'm doing the lichen next to some of the rocks because of the fact that actually in nature, a lot of times we find that moss and lichen and things like that do tend to actually, they tend to kind of crop up on rocks, because of the fact that sometimes water will sit a little bit longer. And for this, what we're actually going to, I'm actually just kind of thinning out that paint, or the glue rather, just a little bit, so that when I go to put down the tuft, it's not kind of squishing out the sides. Now with these tufts, because the underside, I did a review on these, the underside is sticky, so you don't need a ton of glue to stick them down. So you can see there are some pieces of lichen, some pieces of I actually added some wood bits as well. Now those are just twigs. You can actually see them right there in the picture. That those are actually just twigs. Just go outside, pick up some basically twigs from a tree branch, something like that. The reason I'm doing these washes, by the way, guys, is I just did not like the I didn't like the tone. My wife was looking at it at the board when I was working on it, and she was like, "Man, those kind of look like bird poop." And I kind of agreed with her. They were too white. They were just too white. So I decided that I wanted to go back in and kind of touch them down a little bit. And that's why I did the washes. I did different layered washes. And then this is actually the final step of the process. We are just actually adding on the sealant, which is about a 50-50 mix of PVA glue, the Elmer's glue, and water. And now what we're actually going to do is coat the whole thing. We don't want to get it to where it's necessarily white, but you want to make sure that it is that it's down there, that it's kind of a nice layer. So this is the board in its entirety, completely done. You can see all the rocks, all of the details, the little bits and pieces, the lichen, the logs that we put on there, all the flocking, and you can see from this angle how our earth tones that we painted underneath are actually coming through the flock and through everything else that we've done, which is what we were kind of going for. We want to have all of those things at play, because really when you have a gaming surface like this, you want to make sure that there are a lot of things that are of visual interest to when you're playing multiple games. You might notice little details here and there as you're playing, and if you set it up differently, you'll see different things as time goes on, and it will allow you in your gaming to kind of keep interest in what you have created here, and you might not necessarily have to create as many things. I hope you guys have all enjoyed this Stoneforge gaming tutorial, and I will see you in the next one.